In 1874, a column of United States cavalry rode across the Texas Panhandle wearing summer uniforms in dropping temperatures, chasing bands of Comanche warriors across one of the most unforgiving stretches of open land on the entire continent. The wind out there doesn't slow down for anything. There are no mountains to break it, no thick forests to absorb it, nothing but flat grassland stretching in every direction as far as any man could see. And the cold that comes pouring down from Canada in the late autumn moves across that land like it owns it, because for most of human history, it did. Those soldiers, many of them from eastern forts, men who had trained in warmer climates and had never truly experienced the brutal, skin-stripping reality of a plains norther, were suffering badly. They were wet, they were underprepared, and the cold was winning. The Comanche they were chasing were doing something those soldiers could not fully understand. They were sleeping through it. Not barely surviving, not huddled in miserable knots, trying to make it to morning with numb fingers and chattering teeth, but actually sleeping, resting deeply and comfortably enough to wake before dawn, eat a meal, mount their horses, and ride hard before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. That contrast between the army of a modern industrial nation struggling to endure conditions that a so-called primitive people slept through in genuine comfort is the question that pulls this entire story forward. How did they do it? That question sounds simple, and people have answered it with simple answers for a long time. Toughness, they say. Hardiness. These people were just built differently, bred by hard lives into something harder than ordinary men and women. That answer is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that matters enormously, because it misses the actual achievement entirely. Every culture living on the Great Plains was tough. The Kiowa were tough. The Cheyenne were tough. The Arapaho were tough. Toughness is what you develop when your environment demands it of you, and the Southern Plains demanded it of everyone who tried to live there. But toughness alone, physical endurance alone, does not keep your core body temperature stable at 2 in the morning when the ground beneath you is frozen solid and the wind is pulling thermal energy out of your body faster than your metabolism can replace it. Biology doesn't care how tough you are. Physics doesn't make exceptions for cultural pride. When the body loses heat faster than it produces it, you die. And the Comanche were not dying. They were thriving. The real answer was not toughness. The real answer was a system, a layered, interlocking set of solutions that addressed the specific physical problems that extreme cold creates, one by one, layer by layer, with a precision and sophistication that took centuries to develop and that the best military minds of the United States Army eventually concluded they could not match. So they destroyed it instead. But before we get to that destruction, we have to understand exactly what was built. And to understand what was built, you first have to understand where it was built and who built it. The Comanche controlled a territory so vast, so sprawling across the heart of North America, that it had earned its own name on maps. Comancheria. It stretched roughly 240,000 square miles across the southern Great Plains, covering portions of what we now call Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and deep into the heart of Texas, running almost to the Rio Grande in the south. 240,000 square miles is not a small piece of land. That is a territory larger than France. It is larger than the entirety of Spain. For the better part of 2 centuries, from roughly the early 1700s until the 1870s, the Comanche held this territory against everyone who tried to take it, against the Spanish Empire, against the Mexican Republic, against the Republic of Texas, and eventually against the United States of America. They held it because they were extraordinary warriors, and they held it because they knew how to survive on land that their enemies did not. The Ute people, who lived to their northwest and who had long and complicated dealings with the Comanche, gave them their name. In the Ute language, the word that became Comanche translates roughly as anyone who wants to fight me all the time. That is a remarkable thing to be named by your neighbors, and the Comanche had earned it fully. By most serious historical accounts, they were among the most effective mounted warriors anywhere on the North American continent, possibly the most effective. Spanish colonial governors sent reports to Madrid describing the Comanche as a military threat unlike anything they had previously encountered in the Americas. Texas Rangers who faced them in the 1830s and 1840s Men who were themselves hard and violent and experienced in frontier warfare wrote home with something close to awe about the Comanche's speed, their ferocity, and their almost supernatural ability to appear from nowhere and vanish just as completely. The United States Army, which spent decades trying to subdue them and largely failed through direct military engagement, eventually had to completely rethink its entire strategy of plains warfare because of the Comanche. But fighting was not the only skill that defined them. Survival was. And in some ways, survival was the more impressive achievement because warfare is episodic. You fight when the enemy appears. But winter is relentless. It comes every year, it lasts for months, and it does not give you a day off. To understand what the Comanche built to handle winter, you have to stand on the southern plains in December and feel what they were dealing with. The landscape itself looks deceptively simple from the outside. Flat. Open. Grass in every direction, rolling in long waves under the wind, the sky enormous overhead, the horizon a clean line so far away it almost curves. It looks manageable until the cold arrives. When Arctic air moves down from Canada, which it does with great regularity every autumn and winter, it hits the Great Plains with almost nothing to slow it. The Rocky Mountains to the west and the Ozarks to the east create a kind of natural corridor that actually funnels that cold air southward with increased velocity. The Llano Estacado, the great high plateau of the Texas Panhandle, sits at an elevation of roughly 3,000 to 5,000 feet above sea level and is about as exposed to that funneled Arctic air as any piece of terrain on the continent. Wind chill on the Llano Estacado during a serious winter storm does not just feel cold. It is dangerously, life-threateningly cold. The kind of cold that reaches into you and starts pulling the warmth out of your tissues before you've had time to register that you're in trouble. Early Spanish explorers crossing the Llano Estacado in winter wrote about losing men to the cold. American settlers who came later, with wagons and blankets and the full resources of a 19th century supply chain behind them, still suffered frostbite, hypothermia, and death trying to survive winter nights in this country. The U.S. cavalry soldiers riding in 1874 in their summer uniforms were experiencing a version of what everyone who came to this land underprepared experienced. The cold does not negotiate. The Comanche had solved this problem. They had solved it not with a single clever trick, but with a complete system. And that system began not with what they wore, or what they ate, or how they built their shelters, but with something far more fundamental than any of those things. It began with where they chose to sleep. Location. Geography. The deliberate, intelligent selection of the specific place on the landscape where a winter camp would be established. This is the first layer, and it is the foundation on which every other layer rests. Every autumn, as the seasons shifted and the temperatures began their long fall toward the freezing point, Comanche bands made a transition that was as regular and purposeful as any migration in the natural world. They moved off the high, exposed surface of the plains. They moved down, cutting through the edges of the Llano Estacado, hidden beneath the surface of the surrounding grassland, as if the earth itself had kept a secret, are canyons. Deep, dramatic, geologically complex canyons carved by millions of years of water working through the rock beneath the plateau. These canyons are not widely known outside the region, but they are extraordinary. Palo Duro Canyon, located in what is now the Texas Panhandle near the modern city of Amarillo, is the second largest canyon system on the entire North American continent. Only the Grand Canyon is bigger. Palo Duro's walls drop roughly 700 feet below the level of the surrounding plains. That is a 70-story vertical drop into a completely different world. Down at the canyon floor, the landscape is transformed. Water runs through creek beds year-round, fed by springs in the canyon walls. Cottonwood trees and hackberry and juniper grow along the banks of those creeks, providing timber for fuel and building. The exposed rock of the canyon walls holds solar heat through the day and releases it slowly at night, raising the ambient temperature on the canyon floor measurably above what the frozen plateau above experiences. And the walls, those massive, towering walls of red and orange and yellow sedimentary rock, block the wind. They don't just reduce it. They block it. standing on the canyon floor during a norther that is ripping across the Llano Estacado above, you feel almost nothing of that wind. The temperature difference between the exposed plateau and the sheltered canyon floor during a serious winter storm can be substantial, enough to make the canyon not just more comfortable, but genuinely survivable where the plateau above is deadly. The Comanche knew this. They had known it for a very long time. Blanco Canyon, located farther east near what is now Lubbock, Texas, served a similar purpose for different bands. It is not as dramatic in scale as Palo Duro, a broad, shallow valley stretching roughly 30 miles in length, averaging about 1,500 feet in width, cut through by smaller side canyons and arroyos that created a network of natural sheltered spaces within the larger canyon system. The Quahati Comanche, the most independent, the most remote, the most consistently resistant to outside contact of all the Comanche bands, favored Blanco Canyon as a winter campground for generations. They knew its geography the way you know the floor plan of your own house. Every trail in and out of the canyon. Every spring. Every place where the walls created a particularly effective windbreak. Every stand of timber along the creek bed. When Colonel Ranald Mackenzie of the United States Army led a campaign into the region in 1871, 3 years before the decisive events of this story, his soldiers were sent into Blanco Canyon to find the Quahati camps. The results were deeply instructive. Mackenzie's men, trained soldiers operating in their own territory with experienced scouts, got lost. Not briefly disoriented, but genuinely, embarrassingly, helplessly lost in the maze of side canyons and arroyos that the Quahati navigated from memory. One of Mackenzie's officers wrote in his report about the trials and tribulations and much hard talk verging on profanity that his men endured as an entire column of cavalry followed a side canyon to a dead end and had to sit there in the dark until sunrise before they could find their way back out. The Comanche who watched this from the canyon walls, and some of them surely did, would have understood exactly what they were seeing. They were seeing men who did not know the land. And men who do not know the land cannot use the land. The Comanche had migrated south from the Wind River region of present-day Wyoming sometime in the early 1700s. That migration itself had been driven by a combination of factors: the arrival of horses from Spanish colonial settlements to the south, pressure from rival tribes to the north, and the pull of the enormous buffalo herds of the southern plains. In the roughly 170 years between that migration and the events of 1874, the Comanche had learned the southern plains with an intimacy that went far beyond simple familiarity. They had developed an understanding of the land that was essentially ecological. They knew not just where the canyons were, but how each canyon behaved in different weather, which sections of wall created the best windbreaks, which creek beds held water through the driest winters, which canyon floors had enough timber to fuel a camp through the coldest months. This was not instinct. It was accumulated, transmitted knowledge. Observations made by grandparents, passed to parents, passed to children, refined and corrected over generations until the collective understanding of the landscape was as precise and detailed as any survey ever conducted. The selection of a winter camp location was not a casual decision. The Comanche approached it the way a modern structural engineer approaches a building site, with a systematic evaluation of specific physical factors. The canyon walls provided the primary windbreak. The lower elevation created warmer ambient temperatures than the exposed plateau above. The proximity of timber along the creek bed ensured an adequate fuel supply through the winter. The narrowness of canyon access points made the camp defensible against both human enemies and the psychological assault of a blizzard. And the arrangement of the camp within the canyon reflected the same systematic thinking. In winter, when the primary threat was cold and wind, the Comanche arranged their lodges in rows along the most sheltered sections of the canyon floor, oriented to take maximum advantage of the natural windbreak provided by the canyon walls, positioned close to water and close to the timber that would fuel the fires inside each lodge. In summer, when the threat shifted from weather to potential enemies and the primary need shifted from warmth retention to community function, the camp arrangement shifted too. Summer camps were arranged in circles, the classic plains encampment layout that most people picture when they think of indigenous plains culture. The circular arrangement distributed lookout positions evenly around the perimeter, facilitated communal gatherings in the center, and created a layout that worked well on the open, flat ground of the summer plains. These two different arrangements were not random. They were not simply custom or tradition carried forward without thought. They were functional engineering responses to different environmental problems. Winter demanded one configuration. Summer demanded another. The people who lived in those camps understood why. Location was the foundation. It was the passive layer, the one that cost nothing but knowledge to deploy. By choosing the right canyon, the right section of that canyon, the right arrangement of lodges within that section, the Comanche reduced the energy they needed to spend on staying warm because the landscape itself was doing much of the work for them. Every other layer of the system was built on top of that foundation. And the second layer, the one that sat directly on top of the geographical foundation, was the lodge itself, the structure, the shelter. And here we encounter a technology that has been so thoroughly misrepresented in popular culture, so consistently described as primitive, that most people have almost no accurate understanding of what it actually was. The teepee, sometimes spelled teepee, was not a tent. It was not a simple shelter thrown up for convenience and abandoned without ceremony. It was a portable architectural system of extraordinary sophistication, the product of centuries of iterative refinement by people whose survival literally depended on getting the design exactly right. There is no margin for error when the shelter you're sleeping in is the only thing between your family and temperatures that will kill them. The design had been tested and revised and improved through generations of brutal feedback, and what emerged from that process was a structure that solved problems that conventional enclosed buildings had struggled with throughout most of human history. Let's be specific about what the teepee was, because the details matter enormously. The Comanche used a foundation system built from 4 primary poles, a configuration distinct from the 3-pole foundation systems used by tribes to the north like the Sioux and the Cheyenne. The 4-pole system created a slightly different overall shape and weight distribution, and the Comanche had reasons for preferring it in the conditions they faced on the southern plains. On top of that 4-pole foundation, additional poles were leaned in to create the full framework of the structure. A standard Comanche teepee required between 15 and 25 poles in total, each one between 20 and 30 feet in length. These poles were made from lodgepole pine or red cedar, species prized specifically for their tendency to grow straight and slender, without the branching and irregularities that would make them difficult to stack into the precise conical frame the teepee required. Lodgepole pine, as the name directly suggests, was harvested specifically for this purpose, and acquiring good poles was a genuine logistical undertaking for a people living on the southern plains, where those trees did not grow. Poles had to be brought from mountain ranges to the west or traded for, which meant good poles were genuinely valuable, maintained carefully, and transported with real effort. The cover of the teepee was built from buffalo hides, tanned and prepared specifically for this purpose. A standard teepee cover required between 13 and 16 hides, sewn together with remarkable precision into a shape that, when stretched over the pole framework, created a smooth, rain-shedding, wind-deflecting cone. The geometry of that cone was not accidental. The conical shape is inherently stable in high winds because it presents a constantly changing angle to the wind regardless of which direction the wind comes from, and it sheds the lateral force of the wind by deflecting it upward rather than absorbing it. In a region where sustained winds of 40 miles per hour and gusts considerably higher are not unusual, that structural characteristic was not an aesthetic choice. It was an engineering requirement. And the conical shape also handles snow load efficiently. Snow slides off the steeply angled sides rather than accumulating on a flat surface and eventually collapsing the structure. These were the same engineering principles that would eventually show up in modern tent design, arrived at not through mathematics and material science, but through the brutal empirical testing of generations living under these structures in real conditions. But the shape of the teepee was only part of what made it effective. The two features that made the teepee genuinely remarkable as a cold weather shelter were interior features, not immediately visible from the outside, and they addressed what has historically been one of the most difficult problems in human shelter design: fire. The problem is straightforward. You are cold. You want to build a fire inside your shelter to warm it. But if you build a fire inside a sealed space, the smoke has nowhere to go, and you suffocate. If you build an opening at the top to let the smoke out, cold air pours in through that same opening and cancels out the warmth the fire is producing. If you build the fire outside, you have warmth while you're tending it and nothing while you're sleeping. This problem plagued enclosed shelters throughout most of human history. Medieval European buildings had holes in the roof above central hearths that let smoke out, but also let cold air, rain, and snow in. The chimney was a significant technological advance when it was eventually developed in Europe precisely because it finally addressed this problem. The teepee solved it through two design features that worked together. The first was the smoke hole and the adjustable smoke flaps. At the apex of the teepee, the poles were left with a gap between them, creating an opening through which smoke could rise and exit the structure. On either side of this opening were large triangular flaps of hide, each one attached to a long pole that extended from its lower corner to the ground outside the teepee. By adjusting the angle of those poles, the person tending the teepee could control the position of the flaps relative to the wind direction. When the wind was coming from the west, the flaps were adjusted to create a partial deflector that caught the wind and used it to pull smoke up and out of the teepee through the Bernoulli effect, the same fluid dynamics principle used in modern ventilation design. When the wind shifted, the poles were adjusted. This allowed the teepee to maintain an interior fire for both cooking and heat without filling the interior with smoke, even as the wind direction changed throughout the night. It was a continuously adjustable ventilation system operated in real time by the people living in the structure. The second feature was the inner liner. In winter, a secondary layer of hide or heavy canvas was hung inside the teepee, attached to the poles at a height of roughly 5 to 6 feet from the ground, running all the way around the interior circumference of the structure. This created a gap between the outer cover and the interior living space, typically several inches wide. That gap, filled with still air, functioned as insulation. This is precisely the principle that makes a double-pane window more effective than a single pane of glass. The insulating value of any material is largely a function of its ability to trap air and prevent that air from moving, because moving air carries heat away while still air holds it. The dead air space between the teepee's outer cover and its inner liner trapped air and prevented it from circulating, creating a layer of insulation between the cold outside and the warm interior. In the coldest winter conditions, the Comanche stuffed dried grass into that gap, adding another layer of insulating material that dramatically increased the wall's effectiveness at holding interior heat. But the inner liner served another function that is less obvious but equally important. When cold air infiltrates a shelter, it tends to come in at ground level, where gaps between the shelter walls and the ground are typically largest. That cold air, being denser than warm air, sinks and flows along the floor, chilling everything at ground level, including the people sleeping there. The inner liner interrupted this process. Cold air that crept under the outer cover and into the gap between the liner and the outer wall was redirected by the liner upward, where it rose and mixed with the warmer air near the smoke hole rather than pooling on the floor where the family slept. Meanwhile, the fire, which needed fresh air to burn, drew its air from underneath the inner liner, creating a controlled airflow that fed the fire without chilling the sleepers. It was a complete interior climate management system built from hides and poles. The result of all of this, the cone geometry, the smoke flap ventilation, the dead air insulation gap, the airflow management of the inner liner, was a shelter that could be heated to comfortable temperatures with a relatively small interior fire that retained that warmth effectively even in severe cold, that vented smoke without creating dangerous interior air quality, and that maintained all of these functions regardless of which direction the wind was blowing. It also withstood weather that destroyed the alternatives. When winter storms hit the southern plains, the canvas tents issued to U.S. Army soldiers collapsed. Poles snapped under wind load. Pegs pulled out of frozen ground. Canvas tore along seams stressed by sustained high winds. The teepee stood through the same storms because its geometry was designed for exactly this environment. The Comanche leader Quanah Parker, who was himself the son of a Comanche chief and a captured Anglo woman named Cynthia and Parker, and who would eventually become one of the most important figures in the story of the Comanche's forced transition to reservation life, once said something about the teepee that went far beyond its engineering characteristics. He said that the white man goes into his church and talks about Jesus, while the Indian goes into his teepee and talks with Jesus. The teepee was not just a shelter. It was a home in the fullest sense of the word. It was a spiritual space, a social space, a family space. The fire at its center was not just a heat source. It was a focal point for family life, for storytelling, for the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. The arrangement of objects within the teepee, who slept where sacred items were kept, how guests were received, all of it carried meaning that went beyond simple function. But the engineering remained extraordinary regardless of the cultural and spiritual dimensions layered on top of it. And the person who was responsible for that engineering, the person who held the accumulated knowledge of teepee construction and maintenance, and who exercised complete authority over the structure itself, was the Comanche woman. This is not a small point. The teepee belonged to the woman, not in a symbolic sense, not as a courtesy extended by the men of the community, but in a direct, legally recognized, socially enforced sense. The woman owned the teepee. She built it. She maintained it. She decided when it went up and when it came down. She controlled the decision about where the camp was established and how the teepee was positioned within that camp. And she possessed and transmitted the technical knowledge that made the teepee function. A skilled Comanche woman could disassemble a complete teepee, roll the cover, bundle the poles, load everything onto a horse-pulled travois, move the entire camp to a new location miles away, and reassemble the structure into a fully functional shelter in a remarkably short time. The travois itself was an elegant solution to a transportation problem. The teepee poles that formed the skeleton of the shelter during camp became the frame of the travois during movement, two poles dragging behind a horse with a platform or netting between them for carrying the rolled hides and other camp equipment. The poles served double duty without any modification. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was single purpose. When the band arrived at the new camp location, the poles came off the horses, went into the ground in their four-pole configuration, additional poles were leaned in, the cover was unrolled and stretched and laced into place, and the family had a home again. The knowledge required to do this well, the knowledge of which pole went where, how to tension the cover correctly, how to set the smoke flap poles for the prevailing wind direction, how to hang the inner liner, and where to secure it. All of it lived in the women of the community and passed from mother to daughter across generations as a living technical tradition. That knowledge was as critical to Comanche survival as any warrior's ability with a bow or a lance. More critical, in some ways, because the warrior's skills were needed intermittently, in battle, in the hunt. The woman's skills were needed every single night. Every night, the question was the same. Can we stay warm until morning? And every night, the system answered yes. The canyon blocked the wind. The teepee held the heat. But these were the first two layers, and the coldest nights demanded more. Even with the canyon walls doing their work to break the wind, and even with the insulated teepee holding every ounce of heat that its carefully engineered walls could trap, the coldest nights on the southern plains still demanded more. There comes a point in the heart of a January norther, when the air outside drops while below freezing and the frozen ground begins pulling heat out of anything that touches it. That passive shelter alone cannot keep a sleeping body fully safe through the long hours before dawn. That pull of heat downward, the direct conduction of warmth from flesh into frozen earth, is one of the most relentless forms of heat loss a person faces in open ground winter survival, and it attacks continuously for the entire time someone is lying down. The Comanche understood this reality with practical precision, built from generations of experience that had been paid for by observation rather than theory, and so they added a third layer to their system, one that went directly against the sleeper themselves. That layer was the buffalo robe. It is important to understand from the start that a buffalo robe is not the same thing as a buffalo hide, and this distinction was not trivial to the people who depended on them for their lives, but absolutely critical to their ability to stay warm. Hides taken during the warmer months of the year, when the bison's coat was thin and shedding, were best suited for teepee covers, rawhide lashings, moccasins, parfleches, and other utilitarian items that needed strength and durability more than they needed insulation. Robes, on the other hand, were taken almost exclusively during the winter months, between roughly November and March, when the American bison grew its coat to its absolute thickest and densest in response to the same brutal cold that threatened the people hunting them. That winter coat was nature's answer to the plains norther, and the Comanche knew exactly when to harvest it to match that answer to their own needs. The insulating power of buffalo fur comes from a physical property that is remarkably efficient for trapping warmth, and one that modern synthetic insulation would later attempt to imitate without ever fully matching the natural structure itself. The individual guard hairs and underfur of a winter bison are hollow, microscopic air chambers running through the core of many of those fibers, and that hollow structure traps countless pockets of still air between and inside each hair. Trapped air is one of the single best natural insulators that exists in the entire natural world, because air itself is a poor conductor of heat, and when that air is held completely still and cannot move to carry warmth away, it creates an incredibly effective barrier between a warm body and the cold around it. This is the exact same principle that makes down feathers so effective in modern expedition sleeping bags, the same principle behind loose fill insulation in cold weather gear, and the same principle that the dead air space inside the teepee liner was already utilizing on a much larger scale. The Comanche applied that principle directly to the person. A well-tanned winter buffalo robe wrapped around a sleeping individual inside an insulated teepee created what could be called a personal heat envelope, a small pocket of trapped, warmed air held tight around the body that slowed down heat loss on every side it covered. But they did not use robes in a single layer thrown carelessly over the top of someone as they laid down. They layered them with deliberate intent, addressing the two directions that cold attacks a sleeper the most aggressively. First, robes were placed beneath the body, spread out on the ground to insulate against the frozen earth itself, because conduction into the ground will steal body heat relentlessly all night long if there is nothing between flesh and frozen soil to break that transfer. Second, additional robes were laid over the top of the body, draped and wrapped around it to trap the rising warmth that the body naturally gives off, holding that warm air close instead of letting it rise up to the upper reaches of the teepee, where it would be lost far more easily to ventilation. In the most severe stretches of cold, multiple robes would be used for both positions, building up the thickness of that insulating envelope until the family could withstand temperatures that would have rendered a single blanket useless hours before sunrise. This was not guesswork. It was a tested system of thermal layering applied at a human scale, refined across centuries of trial against the worst nights the Llano Estacado could produce. The work that went into turning a raw winter bison hide into one of those soft, flexible, insulating robes fell almost entirely to Comanche women, and it was some of the most labor-intensive work performed in the camp throughout the year. Tanning a buffalo robe properly was not a quick process. It could take days of sustained, physically demanding work for a single hide, requiring scraping every trace of flesh and membrane from the underside with stone or bone tools, stretching it continuously to prevent shrinkage, working brains, liver, or other natural tanning agents into the fibers, and then laboriously softening it by pulling, rubbing, and working the hide over a frame or across a rope until it became supple enough to wrap around a human body without stiffening and cracking in. Sub-zero temperatures. A robe tanned with true skill remained soft, pliable, and highly insulative even in the bitterest freeze. A poorly tanned one would grow stiff as ice, crack along its folds, lose much of its loft, and with it, most of its insulating value. That level of quality control mattered immensely for a people who could not afford to have their bedding fail them on a January night. The value of these robes did not go unnoticed outside of Comancheria either. European fur traders and American commercial interests recognized their extraordinary insulating properties almost immediately upon contact, and buffalo robes became one of the most highly demanded trade goods on the entire Great Plains for much of the early to mid-1800s. They were shipped east in enormous quantities, to Montreal, to New York, to St. Paul, to St. Louis, where they were used as heavy winter blankets, sleigh robes, carriage padding, and expensive cold weather coats for those wealthy enough to afford them. That commercial demand grew voracious over the decades, and it directly fueled the industrial-scale slaughter of the American bison herds that would reach its peak during the 1870s, the very decade in which Comancheria was being forcibly dismantled. The very robes that had kept Comanche families warm through countless plains winters became a commodity that helped finance the destruction of the herds they came from. A tragic irony that played no small part in undermining the foundation of Plains indigenous life as the Red River War drew closer. But even with a sheltered canyon, an insulated teepee, and thick winter robes layered beneath and over the sleeper, there were still nights so cold that those layers alone needed reinforcement. For those nights, the Comanche added a fourth layer to their survival system, one that worked not by trapping air, but by storing and slowly releasing heat over the course of many hours. That layer was heated stones. Long before the fire inside the teepee had burned down for the night, carefully selected stones were placed directly into the heart of that fire and left there to absorb heat for a considerable amount of time. The stones chosen for this were not just any rocks picked up at random off the ground. They had to be dense, non-porous stones, ones that could absorb and hold thermal energy well without cracking from rapid heating or exploding from trapped moisture inside them. Knowledge passed down about which types of stone from the creek beds and canyon walls were safe to heat and which were not. After absorbing heat for hours while the evening meal was cooked and the interior of the teepee stayed warm, those stones would be pulled from the coals with long wooden tongs or carefully handled with green sticks to avoid burning the hands that moved them. Once removed, they were often wrapped in a scrap of thick leather to prevent direct contact burns against skin or against the delicate inner surfaces of the robes, and then tucked deep into the bedding, placed between or alongside the sleepers, nestled down into the layers of robes where their stored heat could radiate outward slowly for the entire remainder of the night. Acting as natural, reusable radiant heaters, those stones would continue giving off warmth long after the last visible flames of the interior fire had died down to nothing but covered embers. Some historical accounts also describe water being poured in very small amounts over heated stones inside the teepee at certain times, creating a brief burst of clean steam that raised the humidity of the dry winter air and gently increased the perceived warmth of the interior without dumping a blast of freezing air in from outside. This principle, heating dense stones and introducing water to create steam in an enclosed, controlled space, was not unique to the Comanche at all. It was used widely across many Plains tribes and formed the functional basis of the sweat lodge as well, used for physical cleansing and deeply important spiritual practices, showing once again an intuitive, practical understanding of heat transfer, thermal mass, and moisture control that was developed through generations of careful observation rather than written equations. In practical terms, the effect stacked beautifully with every layer before it. The canyon walls blocked the wind so the fire could be managed efficiently. The teepee's insulation and ventilation held that heat. The buffalo robes trapped body heat and blocked ground conduction. Now the heated stones added slow, steady radiant warmth directly into the bedding itself, replenishing heat loss hour after hour while most of the camp lay asleep, extending the effective warmth of that small interior fire far beyond the time it would have otherwise provided any benefit. Supporting all of these layers of retention was the careful, disciplined management of fire itself, something that could mean the difference between relighting with ease in the frozen pre-dawn hours or struggling painfully with stiff fingers while the cold pressed in hard against an exhausted family. Rather than letting the interior fire burn itself completely out at the end of the night, the Comanche would allow it to die down to a bed of glowing coals, then cover those remaining coals carefully with a thin layer of ash and sometimes a bit of loose dirt. That covering insulated the embers, drastically slowing their rate of cooling and keeping them alive through the long, still hours of the night instead of letting them go cold. So when morning came, especially on the kind of mornings where frost had settled thick over the outside of the teepee cover and a person's hands were stiff with cold, all that was needed was to uncover those banked coals, gently stir them back to life, and add small pieces of fuel. In many cases, a fire could be roaring again within minutes, instead of spending a half hour coaxing reluctant kindling to catch in freezing, damp air. That small act of foresight, repeated night after night for generations, saved an immense amount of energy and prevented countless situations that could have easily slipped into dangerous hypothermia in the vulnerable hours just before and after sunrise. Fuel for those fires was another logistical reality that the Comanche had solved intelligently for the open southern plains, where large stands of timber are scarce and a person can ride for many miles without seeing anything taller than native grasses. On the vast, treeless stretches of the Llano Estacado, firewood from large trees was not reliably available in the quantities needed for daily cooking and nightly heating, especially for an entire band through the winter months. The solution they used was dried buffalo dung, known across the plains as buffalo chips. Far from being a makeshift desperation fuel, buffalo chips were a practical, abundant, high-value energy source that was available wherever the great bison herds had grazed, which for most of Comancheria meant nearly everywhere the people moved throughout the year. When properly dried in the sun and wind, buffalo chips burn hot. They burn surprisingly steady and long for their size, produce relatively little smoke compared to many green or resinous woods when dry, and they could be gathered in large quantities with very little travel time away from camp. This consistent availability meant fire was never a luxury that had to be rationed out of scarcity through the coldest months, but a reliable tool that could be used every single night to maintain the interior climate of the teepee without stripping limited canyon timber beyond what was needed for poles, tools, or structural purposes. The dried chips fueled the evening fire that heated the stones, kept the coals alive to be banked, cooked the high-calorie meals that would soon fuel the human body itself, and maintained that controllable pocket of warmth that all of the previous layers were built around. All of these external systems, the wind-breaking canyon, the heat-retaining teepee, the ground-insulating and body-wrapping buffalo robes, the slow-radiating heated stones, the banked coals, and the reliable fuel to maintain them, were extraordinarily effective together. But for the longest, coldest nights of the year, there was still one final, internal layer that had to be working in perfect tandem with every one of them to keep the human body from losing the battle against heat loss. That layer was diet. The Comanche diet was built overwhelmingly around the American bison, and more specifically around foods that were extremely high in fat and extremely dense in calories, selected out of necessity for the energy demands that sub-freezing temperatures place onto the human metabolism. Their most important preserved staple food was pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried, shredded buffalo meat and rendered buffalo fat, sometimes mixed with crushed wild berries or native nuts, depending on the season and availability. The word pemmican itself comes from the Cree language, where terms related to it refer to grease or rendered fat, a direct acknowledgement of the ingredient that made it so invaluable for cold weather survival. Nutritionally, pemmican is one of the most calorie-dense complete foods ever developed by any indigenous culture. On average, it contains roughly 450 calories per 100 grams, with a balance heavy in both protein and fat, often around 30 to 35 grams of fat per 100 grams, depending on the ratio of rendered tallow to dried meat. That high fat content is the key to understanding exactly how it helped keep Comanche families warm through freezing nights. When the human body digests fats, the metabolic process produces a sustained form of heat generation known as diet-induced thermogenesis. Unlike simple carbohydrates, which are broken down very quickly and tend to create a short spike of energy followed by a crash, fats take considerably longer for the digestive system to process, releasing energy slowly and steadily over the course of several hours. Eating a high-fat, calorie-dense meal in the late evening, inside a warm, insulated teepee, while wrapped in buffalo robes with heated stones tucked into the bedding, meant the body itself was acting like a slow-burning furnace all throughout the night, continuously producing its own internal heat to replace what was still being lost to the cold air outside the shelter. This matches what has been observed in modern cold weather and Arctic survival research. Controlled studies on humans living and working outdoors in severely cold environments have consistently shown that high-fat diets significantly improve cold tolerance and sustained performance compared to high-carbohydrate diets under prolonged exposure, precisely because of that slower, more stable metabolic heat production. Early European and French-Canadian fur traders and Arctic explorers who adopted pemmican from indigenous peoples discovered this for themselves out of sheer necessity, finding they could travel, work and survive for weeks or even months eating almost nothing else while operating in subarctic conditions, a level of endurance their own European rations could not match at the time. The wild berries that were sometimes added to pemmican were not there for flavor alone either. They provided vitamin C, which helped prevent scurvy during the long winter months when fresh leafy greens and most other plant foods were scarce or unavailable across much of the southern plains. Other high-fat foods supplemented this as well. Buffalo marrow, often extracted from long bones and eaten raw or cooked, was extremely rich in fat and calories. Mesquite beans, processed and sometimes mixed with rendered fat or marrow, added both carbohydrates and nutritional variety when available. Fresh buffalo meat roasted over the open fire was a staple whenever the herds were within reach, and large quantities of dry jerky ensured that traveling bands could still meet their caloric demands while following the herds across great distances even in the colder months. None of this was accidental. It was the product of centuries of refinement by people whose lives depended on the nutritional density of every pound of preserved food they could store for the season when hunting became more difficult and exposure became most dangerous. The human body, under prolonged cold stress, can require anywhere from 25 to 50% more calories per day than it does in temperate conditions just to maintain its core temperature, and that demand only climbs higher with wind exposure and lack of shelter. The Comanche diet met that demand deliberately and efficiently, fueling the innermost furnace of this entire layered system from within. With all of these layers now working in unison, the canyon blocking the wind, the teepee retaining and managing heat, the buffalo robes insulating against ground and air, the heated stones radiating warmth through the night, disciplined fire management keeping coals banked for morning, reliable fuel in the form of dried buffalo chips, and a high-fat diet fueling the body's own sustained thermogenesis. The system reached its full strength. Each layer reinforced the weaknesses of the others. If a storm soaked some of the firewood for a time, the robes, the stones, the windbreak of the canyon, and the insulation of the teepee still carried most of the burden. If hides were a little thinner for a season, the high-fat meal before sleep and the body heat being conserved more carefully could compensate. If the wind shifted violently outside, the adjustable smoke flaps and the natural protection of the canyon walls absorbed it. This built-in redundancy is what made the Comanche winter camps so resilient year after year, through storms that routinely killed underprepared travelers and soldiers who had entered their territory with none of these protections. It was not one clever trick passed down as a folk tale. It was an entire, coherent survival technology developed, tested, adjusted, and preserved across generations of people who could not afford for that technology to fail even once on a freezing plains night. And it worked so well for so long that when outsiders finally encountered families sleeping comfortably through conditions that left their own troops miserable and freezing, many of them mistook that comfort for some kind of innate, mythical hardiness instead of recognizing the generations of meticulous work, engineering, and ecological knowledge that had created it. That misunderstanding would prove to be a dangerous one, because the United States Army, once it fully realized just how effective that system truly was at allowing the Comanche to endure the southern plains through the winter and return to fight again in the spring, would stop trying to outlast or outfight that system through open combat alone. It would decide, with deliberate calculation, to destroy it entirely. There was one more element in the Comanche survival system that tied everything together. One more layer that most people overlook entirely when they think about how indigenous plains peoples endured the brutal winters of the southern Great Plains, and it was arguably the single most important relationship in the entire Comanche world: the horse. The Comanche relationship with horses was not like anything the United States Army had encountered before, not like anything European settlers had seen, not like anything that existed in the military traditions of the Western world at that time. It was deeper than utility, more complex than ownership, and more central to every aspect of Comanche life than any single tool, weapon, or resource they possessed. To understand how horses fit into the winter survival system, you first have to understand how they fit into everything else, because the horse was not just one piece of the Comanche world. It was the axis around which the entire world turned. The Comanche acquired their first horses from Pueblo Indians in the years following the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, when the Pueblo peoples of present-day New Mexico rose up against their Spanish colonial rulers and drove them south across the Rio Grande. The revolts scattered Spanish livestock, including horses, across the region, and the Pueblo communities that had been forced to tend those horses under Spanish rule now controlled them independently. Through trade, raid, and direct contact with the Pueblo, the Comanche, who at that time were still a relatively small, semi-nomadic people living in the Wind River region of present-day Wyoming and only beginning to drift southward, obtained their first mounts. What happened next was one of the most rapid and complete cultural transformations in the recorded history of North America. Within a single generation, the Comanche went from a people who traveled on foot, who hunted on foot, who fought on foot, who carried their belongings on dog-pulled travois, to a people who were so thoroughly mounted that the horse became inseparable from their identity. Within 2 generations, they had become what many historians consider the finest light cavalry in the Western Hemisphere, and possibly on Earth. Boys began learning to ride before the age of 6. Not casually, not recreationally, but with the intensity and discipline of a skill that their survival would depend upon for the rest of their lives. By the time a Comanche boy had reached the age at which he would begin participating in raids and hunts, typically in his early to mid-teens, he could do things on horseback that left European and American observers genuinely stunned. He could hang off the side of a horse at full gallop, using the animal's body as a shield against incoming arrows or gunfire, with nothing but the crook of one heel over the horse's spine and one arm looped through a rawhide strap braided into the mane holding him in place. From that position, suspended almost entirely below the line of the horse's back and moving at speeds that would make most riders lose their grip in seconds, he could fire arrows with accuracy from under the horse's neck. Not one arrow. Multiple arrows. The Comanche could loose arrows at a rate that outpaced the reload time of most firearms available to the U.S. cavalry until the introduction of repeating rifles, which meant that in a close engagement, a Comanche warrior could put several arrows into a target in the time it took a soldier to fire once, fumble with powder and ball, and fire again. The artist George Catlin, who was one of the first Europeans to document Comanche life in detail during the 1830s, wrote about this with something approaching disbelief. He described the Comanche on foot as awkward, clumsy, slow, a people who seemed almost uncomfortable walking on the ground. But the moment they touched a horse, Catlin wrote, they were transformed into something entirely different, something graceful and fast, and supremely confident. On horseback, they were among the most expert and daring riders in the world, and Catlin had traveled widely enough to know what he was comparing them to. An Englishman named William Blackmore, who spent roughly 8 years living among the Comanche and observing their daily life and customs, described them in similar terms. On foot, slow and awkward. On horseback, graceful and without equal. The U.S. cavalry, which considered itself a professional mounted fighting force trained in the European tradition of cavalry warfare, was consistently and embarrassingly outmaneuvered by Comanche warriors in open engagement. The cavalry rode in formation. The Comanche did not. The cavalry charged in lines. The Comanche attacked in fluid, shifting groups that broke apart and reformed like water flowing around rocks, striking from multiple angles simultaneously, withdrawing before a countercharge could be organized, then wheeling back to hit again from a direction the soldiers had not expected. The cavalry's horses were trained to follow commands. The Comanche's horses were trained to think with their riders. The bond between a Comanche warrior and his best war horse was not the bond between a soldier and a piece of military equipment. It was closer to the bond between two athletes who have trained together for so long that they anticipate each other's movements without conscious thought. The horse responded to pressure from the rider's knees, to shifts in weight, to signals so subtle that an observer could not see them being given. This freed the rider's hands entirely for combat, something the cavalry could not replicate because their own riding technique required at least one hand on the reins at nearly all times. The U.S. Army, recognizing this advantage, actually tried on several occasions to steal Comanche-trained horses, believing that the animals themselves were the source of the superiority they were witnessing. They captured Comanche horses and put their own soldiers on them. It did not work. The horses would not respond to the soldiers the way they responded to the Comanche riders who had raised and trained them. The advantage was not in the animal. It was in the relationship. and that relationship could not be transferred by simply changing the person sitting on the horse's back. Horses were also the foundation of Comanche wealth and social standing. A person's herd size was one of the most important markers of their position within the community. A successful warrior or leader might control dozens of horses personally, and a wealthy family could own 100 or more. The total herd size of an entire Comanche band could number in the hundreds or even the low thousands. These were not feral animals rounded up and half-broken for temporary use. The Comanche bred horses selectively, developing bloodlines that emphasized the qualities they valued most: speed, endurance, intelligence, and temperament. Different horses were trained for different purposes. There were horses specifically trained for buffalo hunting, animals that could run alongside a stampeding herd at full speed, while the rider leaned down and drove a lance or arrow into a running bison at close range, a feat that required the horse to maintain its position relative to a panicking, wildly swerving animal that outweighed it by a factor of 5 or more without guidance from the reins because the rider's hands were occupied with the weapon. There were horses trained specifically for war, animals selected for courage and steadiness under the chaos of combat, horses that would not shy from the noise and violence of a fight, and that could execute the rapid direction changes and bursts of acceleration that the Comanche style of mounted warfare demanded. There were horses kept for racing, a social activity and form of gambling that was deeply popular among the Comanche, and that served the secondary purpose of constantly testing and refining the speed and competitive instinct of the herd's best animals. And there were horses used simply for transportation and packing, the working animals that carried the travois when camp moved, and that allowed the Comanche to follow the buffalo herds across hundreds of miles of open territory in a way that would have been physically impossible on foot. Beyond all of these functions, the Comanche had built an entire economic system around the horse trade. They traded horses northward to other plains tribes, southward into Mexico, and eventually to European and American traders as well. Their trading network stretched across an enormous geographical range, and their reputation as horse breeders and trainers was recognized across the entire Great Plains region. Horses were currency, horses were diplomacy, horses were power. A raid to capture horses from a rival group was not just an act of aggression. It was an economic operation. The Comanche raided deep into Mexico for horses, crossing the Rio Grande and striking at ranches and settlements hundreds of miles south of their core territory, returning with herds that replenished and expanded their own stock. These raids were conducted with the same tactical sophistication that characterized their warfare, using speed, surprise, knowledge of terrain, and the endurance of riders who could cover distances in a day that their pursuers could not match. All of this context is necessary to understand the final role that horses played in the winter survival system, because that role was not metaphorical. It was physical, measurable, and critically important. Rival plains tribes, people who knew the Comanche well and who had their own deep experience with horses, told stories about the Comanche bringing their best horses directly into the teepee at night during the coldest winter weather. This was not sentimentality. This was not a quaint cultural practice born from excessive affection for a pet. This was thermodynamics. A horse is a large mammal. A typical Comanche pony, smaller than the heavy cavalry mounts used by the U.S. Army, but still a substantial animal, weighed somewhere in the range of 700 to 900 pounds. An animal of that size generates a very significant amount of metabolic body heat simply by existing, by breathing, by digesting food, by maintaining its own core temperature. In an enclosed space like a teepee, which was specifically designed to retain heat and prevent it from escaping into the cold air outside, the presence of a large, warm-blooded animal radiating heat throughout the night made a real, measurable, physically significant difference to the interior temperature. It was not a trivial contribution. It was substantial enough that the Comanche, a people who wasted nothing and who did not engage in practices that served no functional purpose, considered it worth the considerable inconvenience of having a horse inside their living space. The horse added warmth. The horse was also safer inside, protected from theft by rival tribes who might try to run off the herd under cover of darkness, and protected from predators, from the cold itself, and from the risk of wandering off during a blizzard when visibility dropped to nothing, and even a well-trained animal might drift with the wind. Some accounts from the period describe Comanche families prioritizing the shelter of their best horses over the comfort of human family members during the worst storms. A favorite war horse or a prized buffalo runner might be brought inside, while people slept closer to the door or under less optimal conditions, because the loss of that animal would be catastrophic to the family's ability to hunt, to fight, to travel, and to maintain their social and economic standing within the band. The horse was not expendable. In many ways, the horse was the single most valuable thing the family possessed. It made everything else possible. Without horses, the Comanche could not follow the buffalo herds. Without the herds, there were no hides for the teepee, no robes for bedding, no meat for pemmican, no marrow for high-fat fuel, no chips for the fire. Without the fire, the heated stones had no heat source. Without the teepee, the heated stones and robes had no enclosed space to work within. The horse was not just a layer in the system. It was the thread that connected every other layer to the landscape and to the herds that made all of them possible. Now, step back and look at the full system assembled, all of its layers working in concert on a freezing January night somewhere in the depths of Palo Duro Canyon. The canyon walls rise 700 feet above the camp, sheer faces of ancient sedimentary rock glowing faintly in whatever starlight or moonlight filters down to the floor. Up on the surface of the Llano Estacado, a norther is tearing across the open grassland at speeds that would strip heat from an exposed body in minutes. Down on the canyon floor, the wind is reduced to almost nothing. The difference in temperature between the exposed plateau and the sheltered canyon bottom is significant enough to mean the difference between danger and comfort, between a night spent fighting for survival and a night spent sleeping. Along the creek bed, cottonwood trees stand dark against the canyon walls. The sound of running water is faint beneath the thin skin of ice forming along the creek's edges. Teepee poles rise in neat rows, their tips converging against the sky, thin trails of smoke curling upward from the smoke holes and dissolving into the cold air above. Inside one of those teepees, the inner liner hangs from the poles, creating that crucial dead air gap between the outer cover and the interior living space. The gap that might be stuffed with dried grass for extra insulation during the worst cold snaps. The smoke flaps at the top are adjusted for whatever direction the faint canyon breeze is coming from, drawing smoke upward and out while preventing cold air from pouring in. A low fire burns at the center, its light casting soft, shifting shadows on the liner walls. Stones sit in the coals, absorbing heat, growing hot enough that they will radiate warmth for hours after they are pulled from the fire and tucked into the bedding. A family is settling in for the night. Buffalo robes are spread on the ground, thick winter hides with their dense, hollow cord fur facing upward, blocking the relentless conduction of heat into the frozen earth. More robes are ready to be pulled over the top, wrapping the sleepers in a cocoon of trapped warm air that their own body heat will sustain. The evening meal has been eaten, and it was rich, heavy with rendered buffalo fat, pemmican that has been stored since the autumn processing, perhaps some marrow cracked from long bones earlier in the day, food dense enough in fat and calories that the digestive process will generate sustained metabolic heat for hours into the night, fueling the body's own internal furnace long after the fire has burned low. A horse stands near the entrance, tied loosely to a stake driven into the ground inside the teepee, its large, warm body radiating heat into the enclosed space, its breathing slow and steady in the quiet. The heated stones are pulled from the coals, wrapped in scraps of leather, and placed into the bedding. Their warmth spreads immediately, a slow, deep heat that will last through the darkest hours before dawn. The remaining coals are covered with ash, insulated to stay alive until morning, when they will be uncovered and coaxed back to life with a handful of dried buffalo chips to start the new day's fire in minutes instead of the painful half-hour struggle that a cold start would require. Every layer is in place. The canyon blocks the wind. The teepee traps the heat. The liner insulates the walls and directs cold drafts upward away from the sleepers. The robes beneath block ground conduction. The robes above trap rising body heat. The heated stones radiate stored warmth into the bedding. The high-fat meal fuels internal thermogenesis for hours. The horse adds its own body heat to the shared enclosed space. The banked coals ensure a quick fire at dawn. No single one of those layers would be sufficient on its own. A canyon without a teepee is just a cold ditch with less wind. A teepee without robes is a cold shell with better air management. Robes without a high-fat diet still leave the body running out of fuel before sunrise. Heated stones without an insulated shelter just cool off faster because the heat they release is immediately lost to the open air. But together, each layer compensating for the weaknesses and limitations of the others, the system created conditions that were not merely survivable, but genuinely comfortable. Comfortable enough to sleep through. Comfortable enough to wake rested. Comfortable enough to do it again the next night, and the night after that, and every night for the 4 or 5 months of cold that the southern plains winter could throw at them. That redundancy, that ability of each layer to pick up the slack when another layer was compromised, was what made the system so resilient over such a long period of time. Winter is not a single event. It is months of sustained stress, and a system that works perfectly on the first cold night but collapses under the accumulated strain of the 40th or 50th cold night is not a real solution. The Comanche system worked for months at a time, year after year, generation after generation, because its redundancy meant that no single point of failure could bring the whole thing down. A wet storm might soak some of the firewood stacked near the teepee, making it harder to maintain the interior fire for a night or two. But the robes still insulated. The canyons still blocked the wind. The pemmican stores still fueled the body's heat production. The heated stones from a smaller fire still radiated warmth into the bedding. A shortage of good hides in a lean year might mean thinner teepee covers or fewer ropes. But the canyon's windbreak and the banked coals and the horse's body heat and the calorie-dense diet filled the gap and kept the family alive until the spring hunts could replenish the supply. An unexpected shift in wind direction in the middle of the night might temporarily compromise the teepee's smoke ventilation. But the adjustable smoke flaps could be corrected, and in the meantime, the robes and stones and internal thermogenesis kept the sleepers warm enough to handle the disruption without crisis. Every layer was a backup for every other layer. And it was this characteristic, this deep, systemic resilience, that made the Comanche winter camp something the United States Army could not simply outlast or wait out. The Army had tried waiting. For years, the standard approach to dealing with hostile plains tribes had been to campaign in the warmer months, when the Army's supply lines could function and its soldiers could operate in the field without freezing, and then to withdraw to its forts for the winter, hoping that the cold would do what its soldiers could not. The cold did nothing to the Comanche. They sat in their canyons, warm and fed and rested, and when spring came, they rode out onto the open plains again, exactly as strong as they had been the previous autumn, and the cycle began again. The Army fought campaigns in 1858, in 1860, in 1864, in 1867, in 1868, in 1871, and in 1872. Each time, it inflicted damage. Each time, the Comanche absorbed that damage, retreated into their winter sanctuaries, recovered, and came back. Each time, the Army's commanders wrote frustrated reports about the impossibility of delivering a decisive blow against a people who could simply disappear into the landscape when the weather turned. The problem was not a lack of military capability. The U.S. Army in the 1870s had more soldiers, more guns, more ammunition, more logistical capacity, and more industrial resources than every plains tribe combined. The problem was that the Comanche's survival system made them functionally unreachable for roughly half the year. They could be hurt. They could be raided. Their villages could be attacked when found, but they could not be broken because they could always retreat, always recover, always rebuild. The system kept them alive, and as long as it kept them alive, the military resistance continued. By 1874, the United States government and military leadership had concluded that the only way to end the conflict on the southern plains was to attack not the warriors themselves, but the infrastructure that sustained them. The strategy was explicitly articulated at the highest levels of command. General Philip Sheridan, who oversaw military operations on the plains, had already demonstrated the approach during the winter campaign of 1868-69 against the Southern Cheyenne, when he sent Colonel George Armstrong Custer to attack Chief Black Kettle's village on the Washita River in what is now western Oklahoma. That attack, launched at dawn on a freezing November morning, destroyed the village, killed an unknown number of Cheyenne, including Black Kettle himself, and captured or slaughtered over 800 ponies. The strategic lesson was clear. You did not need to kill every warrior. You needed to destroy the things that allowed the warriors to survive the winter. Without tipis, they had no shelter. Without stored food, they had no calories to fuel their bodies through the cold months. Without robes, they had no insulation. Without horses, they could not hunt, could not travel, could not fight, could not maintain their way of life. Destroy those things, and the warriors would have no choice but to come into the reservations or die on the open plains. This was the strategy that shaped the Red River War of 1874, the final military campaign against the Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne on the Southern Plains. The Red River War was not a single battle but a coordinated, multi-column campaign designed to converge on the last free bands from every direction simultaneously, driving them out of their strongholds and denying them the ability to scatter and regroup as they had done so many times before. 5 separate columns of troops were sent into the field from different forts in different directions, creating a net of military pressure that was intended to prevent the bands from simply riding away from any single threat as they had always done in the past. Colonel Nelson Miles marched south from Fort Dodge in Kansas. Colonel John Davidson moved west from Fort Sill in Indian Territory. Lieutenant Colonel George Buell advanced northwest from Fort Griffin in Texas. Major William Price pushed east from Fort Union in New Mexico. And Colonel Ranald Mackenzie, commanding the 4th United States Cavalry, moved north from Fort Concho in central Texas. Of all 5 columns, it was Mackenzie's that would deliver the decisive blow. Ranald Slidell Mackenzie was, by 1874, arguably the most effective and most feared Indian fighter in the United States Army. He had graduated first in his class at West Point in 1862 and had served with distinction throughout the Civil War, rising rapidly through the ranks and being wounded 6 times in 4 years of combat. By the war's end, he held the brevet rank of Major General at the age of 24. Ulysses S. Grant, who had commanded armies containing hundreds of generals, called Mackenzie the most promising young officer in the Army. After the Civil War, Mackenzie was assigned to the Texas frontier, where he spent the better part of a decade learning how to fight Plains Indians through direct, often painful experience. His first major engagement with the Comanche, the 1871 campaign into Blanco Canyon, had taught him how difficult the terrain was and how easily the Comanche could use it to their advantage. His soldiers had gotten lost inside canyons. His camp had been raided at night by Quahati warriors who stampeded his horses. He had chased the Comanche onto the Llano Estacado and found himself operating in country so flat and featureless that his men could barely navigate. He had learned, the hard way, that fighting the Comanche on their own terms in their own territory was an exercise in frustration. But Mackenzie was not the kind of man who repeated his mistakes. He was methodical, relentless, and willing to be brutal when he concluded that brutality was the most efficient path to his objective. The 1871 campaign had taught him where the Comanche went in winter. The 1872 campaign, during which he attacked a Comanche village on the North Fork of the Red River and captured over 120 women and children along with a large horse herd, had taught him what happened when you struck the camps directly. By 1874, Mackenzie understood the Comanche winter survival system as well as any non-Comanche person alive. He understood the canyons. He understood the role of the stored food and the horse herds. He understood that the tipis and the robes and the pemmican were not just possessions but the physical components of a survival infrastructure that, if destroyed, could not be rebuilt before winter set in. And he understood that Palo Duro Canyon, the deepest, most sheltered, most strategically important of all the Comancheria winter refuges, was the place where the largest concentration of those components would be gathered as autumn turned to winter. Through the late summer and early autumn of 1874, the Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne bands that had not yet surrendered to reservation life had been gathering in and around Palo Duro Canyon, doing exactly what their ancestors had done every year for as long as anyone could remember. They were preparing for winter. Teepees were being erected along the canyon floor. Buffalo meat was being dried and pemmican was being processed and stored. Robes were being tanned. Horse herds were being grazed on the grass of the canyon floor and the surrounding breaks. The bands were building up the supplies and infrastructure they would need to survive the coming cold months, the same layered system that had carried them through every winter before this one. A Kiowa spiritual leader named Mamandi, who was also known as Skywalker and who held significant influence among the gathered bands, had performed ceremonies and made assurances to the people that they would be safe in the canyon. The steep walls, the narrow access trails, the sheer physical difficulty of the terrain, all of it had protected them before, and Mamandi told the people that the spirits confirmed it would protect them again. The canyon was their sanctuary. It had always been their sanctuary. No army had ever successfully penetrated it, and many of the people gathered there believed that no army ever would. They were wrong. Through the second half of September 1874, Mackenzie's column of roughly 400 soldiers from the 4th Cavalry, accompanied by Tonkawa and Seminole Negro scouts, moved north across the Llano Estacado toward the Palo Duro region. The Tonkawa scouts were critical to this operation. The Tonkawa were a Texas tribe with a long and bitter history of conflict with the Comanche, and they had allied with the United States Army specifically because they saw the Army as a weapon they could aim at their oldest enemy. They knew the country. They knew where the canyons were. They knew where the trails into those canyons could be found. On the evening of September 27, 1874, Mackenzie's column reached the vicinity of Palo Duro Canyon. The Tonkawa scouts moved ahead of the main body, searching for a way down the canyon wall that could accommodate mounted troops. What they found was a narrow, steep, winding trail that descended from the rim of the canyon to the floor, 700 feet below. It was not a road. It was barely a path. In places, it was narrow enough that only one horse could pass at a time, and the drop on either side was severe enough that a single misstep would send horse and rider tumbling hundreds of feet to the rocks below. Mackenzie made the decision to descend that night, under cover of darkness, and attack the camps at dawn. It was an extraordinary gamble. If the Comanche discovered the column on the trail before it reached the canyon floor, the soldiers would be trapped in single file on a narrow path with no room to maneuver, no way to retreat quickly, and no ability to bring their superior numbers and firepower to bear. A handful of warriors positioned at the bottom of the trail could have held off the entire column, picking off soldiers one by one as they emerged from the narrow descent. But Mackenzie calculated that surprise was worth the risk, and he was right. The descent began before dawn on the morning of September 28, 1874. The soldiers moved in single file down the canyon wall in near total darkness, their horses picking their way along the trail by feel as much as by sight, the sound of hooves on loose rock echoing off the canyon walls in the pre-dawn stillness. It took hours for the full column to reach the canyon floor. As the leading elements emerged onto the flat ground at the bottom, the first light of dawn was beginning to color the eastern rim of the canyon. Spread out along the canyon floor in front of them, arranged in the rows that characterized Comanche winter encampments, were the camps. Tipis lined the creek bed. Horse herds grazed on the canyon grass. Smoke from morning fires was beginning to rise from the camps. The people inside those tipis were waking to what they believed was another ordinary autumn morning in the sanctuary that had sheltered their families for generations. A Comanche leader named Red War Bonnet spotted the soldiers just before the attack began. There are accounts that suggest he was one of the first people awake that morning, possibly tending to horses or checking the camp perimeter, and that he saw the dark shapes of mounted soldiers emerging from the trail at the base of the canyon wall, while there was still barely enough light to distinguish them from the rocks and shadows around them. He raised the alarm, but there was not enough time. The distance between the trail's exit point and the nearest camps was too short, and the soldiers were already moving. There was not enough time to organize a coordinated defense. Iron Shirt of the Cheyenne, Poor Buffalo of the Comanche, and Lone Wolf of the Kiowa were all present with their bands in the canyon that morning. But the surprise was too complete, and the geography too constrained for them to mount a unified response. The camps erupted into chaos. Warriors scrambled for weapons and horses. Women grabbed children. People ran in every direction, some toward the creek, some toward the canyon walls, some toward the narrow side canyons that branched off from the main canyon floor. Some warriors did manage to take positions among the rocks and brush and fired on the advancing soldiers, and there were scattered firefights along the canyon floor that lasted for portions of the morning. But the organized, massed resistance that might have turned the battle never materialized. The surprise had been too complete. Most of the people in the canyon fled. They scrambled up the canyon walls on foot, climbing trails that the horses could not follow, leaving behind everything they could not carry in their hands, which was almost everything. They left behind the tipis. They left behind the stored food. They left behind the buffalo robes. They left behind the pemmican. They left behind the dried meat. They left behind the tanning frames and the processing tools and the winter supplies that had taken months to accumulate. They fled up the canyon walls and out onto the frozen surface of the Llano Estacado above, wearing what they had been sleeping in, carrying what they could grab in the seconds between the alarm and the necessity of running. The battle itself, in terms of direct combat casualties, was remarkably light. Mackenzie's forces reported only one soldier wounded during the entire engagement. The number of Indian casualties is disputed, with some accounts suggesting very few were killed in the initial attack and the scattered skirmishing that followed. The Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne warriors who fought rearguard actions among the rocks and brush of the canyon floor did so with the primary goal of covering the escape of the women, children, and elderly, and in this they largely succeeded. The people got out. Most of them, at least, survived the morning. But survival in the immediate sense, getting out of the canyon alive, was not the same as survival in the larger sense. Because what Mackenzie did after the shooting stopped was the act that broke the Comanche. It was not a battle. It was a calculated demolition. He burned everything. Every teepee in the canyon was set on fire. The lodge poles, some of them carried and maintained for years, hauled across hundreds of miles on travois, selected from mountain forests far to the west, were put to the torch. The buffalo hide covers, painstakingly tanned by Comanche women over days of labor, sewn together with careful precision, were destroyed. The stored food was burned. The pemmican that had been prepared and packed for the winter months ahead, the dried meat that would have sustained families through the coldest stretches when hunting was difficult or impossible, the rendered fat and marrow stores, all of it was piled and set ablaze. The buffalo robes, winter-taken hides with their thick, hollow cord fur still intact, the personal insulation layer that kept sleeping bodies warm through freezing nights, were thrown onto the fires. The tanning frames and tools were destroyed. The rawhide containers and storage vessels were burned. Everything that represented the physical infrastructure of the winter survival system, every component of every layer, was systematically and deliberately destroyed on that canyon floor. The smoke from the burning camps rose in a column that could be seen for miles, a dark pillar of destruction visible against the morning sky from the rim of the canyon and from the open plains beyond. And then Mackenzie dealt with the horses. His soldiers had captured a herd of over 1,000 ponies from the canyon camps. Over 1,000 animals. War horses, buffalo runners, pack horses, breeding mares, young colts. The entire equine wealth of multiple bands gathered in one place for the winter. Mackenzie understood with absolute clarity what those horses meant. He had fought the Comanche long enough to know that the horse was the single, most critical element of their entire way of life. Without horses, they could not follow the herds. Without horses, they could not hunt effectively. Without horses, they could not fight. Without horses, they could not flee. Without horses, they could not rebuild. If the Comanche recovered those horses, Mackenzie knew, they would scatter across the plains, hunt new buffalo, process new hides, build new teepees, prepare new pemmican, and be ready to fight again by spring, just as they had done after every previous campaign. He could not allow that. Some of the captured horses were distributed to the Tonkawa and Seminole Negro Scouts as payment and reward for their service. A small number of the best animals were kept for army use. The rest, the overwhelming majority of more than 1,000 horses, were slaughtered. Mackenzie ordered them killed. The animals were shot in groups, their bodies left on the canyon floor alongside the ashes of the teepees and the burned remains of the winter supplies. Over 1,000 horses killed in the canyon that had sheltered Comanche families for generations, the canyon where boys had learned to ride, where young horses had been trained, where the herds had grazed on winter grass, while the families they belonged to slept warm and safe above them in insulated teepees. The destruction was total. The canyon floor, which that morning had been a functioning winter camp, A living community preparing for the cold months with the accumulated knowledge and infrastructure of centuries, was now a field of ash, carcasses, and ruin. The smoke from the fires drifted up through the canyon and out over the Llano Estacado. The people who had fled were somewhere out there on the open plains, exposed, freezing, without shelter, without food, without horses, watching that smoke and knowing what it meant. Everything was gone. And winter was coming. The people who escaped the canyon that morning faced a reality that was almost impossible to survive. They were on the open Llano Estacado, the most exposed high plateau in the entire region, without tipis, without robes, without stored food, without horses. Every layer of the survival system that had sustained them for generations had been stripped away in a single morning. The canyon that had blocked the wind was now occupied by the army. The tipis that had trapped heat were ashes. The robes that had insulated against the frozen ground were burned. The pemmican that had fueled their bodies' heat production was destroyed. The heated stones could not be used without a shelter to retain their warmth. The horses that had provided body heat, transportation, and the ability to hunt were dead on the canyon floor. There was nothing left. The approaching winter, which in every previous year had been a season to be managed and survived using the comprehensive system their ancestors had built, was now a death sentence for anyone who stayed on the open plains without that system's protection. Some of the bands that fled Palo Duro tried to hold out. They scattered across the breaks and smaller canyons of the region, attempting to find shelter and to hunt on foot for whatever game they could find. But hunting buffalo on foot, without horses, in late autumn conditions on the open plains, was not the same as hunting from horseback. It was slow, inefficient, and dangerous, and it could not produce anywhere near the quantity of meat, hides, and fat needed to rebuild the winter infrastructure that had been destroyed. They could not tan enough hides for new teepees without the processing time and tools. They could not prepare enough pemmican without the buffalo kills that horses made possible. They could not replace the robes without winter bison hunts that required mounted pursuit. Every element of recovery required time, resources, and capacity that they no longer had. And the army knew this. Mackenzie did not need to chase down every individual family. He did not need to fight another pitched battle. He had destroyed the system, and without the system, the calendar did his work for him. Every day that passed brought the temperature lower. Every night was colder than the last. Every morning, the people who were still out on the plains woke more exhausted, more hungry, more exposed than the day before. Some of the bands began coming into the reservation at Fort Sill within weeks. By November 1874, a substantial number of the Comanche and Kiowa who had fled Palo Duro had surrendered. The Quahati, the most independent band, the ones who had held out the longest and fought the hardest, and who had believed most deeply that the open plains and the canyons would sustain them forever, held on longer than the rest. But even the Quahati could not survive a plains winter without the system. The last Quahati holdouts, including the young leader Quanah Parker, surrendered at Fort Sill in June of 1875. They rode in on gaunt horses, thin and worn from months of running and hiding and starving on the open plains, and they surrendered not because they had been defeated in battle, but because the survival system that had made their resistance possible had been destroyed and could not be rebuilt in the time the winter gave them. The Battle of Palo Duro Canyon was the last major engagement of the Red River War. It was the engagement that broke the military resistance of the Southern Plains tribes. And it was won not through superior combat, but through the deliberate, calculated destruction of a survival infrastructure that the United States Army had concluded it could not match, could not outlast, and could not defeat through any other means. That fact alone tells you everything you need to know about how effective the Comanche winter survival system truly was. The most powerful military force on the continent, backed by the full industrial and logistical capacity of a nation of 40 million people, looked at a system built from canyon walls, buffalo hides, animal fat, and heated rocks, and concluded that the only way to win was to make sure that system could never be used again. They did not try to copy it. They did not try to adapt it. They did not try to build something better. They burned it to the ground and killed the horses, because that was easier than trying to beat it. The smoke that rose from Palo Duro Canyon on the morning of September 28, 1874, did not just mark the end of a battle. It marked the end of a way of life that had sustained a people across nearly 2 centuries of continuous adaptation on some of the most demanding terrain in North America. But what happened after the burning? What happened in the weeks and months and years that followed the destruction of the camps and the slaughter of the horses is a story that most people never hear because it is slower and quieter than the battle itself, and it does not lend itself to the kind of dramatic retelling that historians and filmmakers prefer. It is the story of what happens to a people when the physical infrastructure of their entire civilization is reduced to ash in a single morning, and it is a story that deserves to be told in full. The bands that fled Palo Duro Canyon did not all surrender immediately. That is an important thing to understand, because the speed of collapse is often exaggerated in historical accounts that want to draw a clean line between the battle and the end of Comanche independence. The reality was messier, slower, and far more painful than a single decisive moment. Some families and small groups scattered across the broken country north and east of the canyon, moving through the network of smaller canyons and arroyos that cut through the edges of the Caprock Escarpment, trying to find shelter in terrain they knew intimately, but that could no longer provide what they needed without the infrastructure they had lost. They knew where the springs were. They knew where the smaller canyon walls provided some protection from the wind. They knew where mesquite and juniper grew thick enough to provide fuel for small fires. But knowing where to find shelter and actually being sheltered are not the same thing when you have no teepee to erect, no inner liner to hang, no smoke flaps to adjust, no robes to wrap around your children at night. A canyon wall blocks the wind, yes, but without a teepee to trap the heat from a fire, that fire's warmth is carried away almost as fast as it is produced. A small fire in the open, even in a sheltered canyon, does almost nothing for a person trying to sleep through a freezing night. It warms the side of you that faces it and leaves the side that faces away exposed to the cold, and you spend the entire night turning back and forth, never truly warm, never truly resting, burning through calories and energy that you cannot replace because you have no stored food and no horses to hunt with. Some of the people who fled had managed to grab a robe or a blanket in the chaos of the attack, and those who had even a single layer of insulation were measurably better off than those who had nothing. But a single robe without a shelter is a fraction of the system, and fractions do not keep you alive through a plains winter the way the complete system did. The cold of October on the southern plains is not yet the killing cold of January, but it is cold enough to weaken, to exhaust, to strip the reserves from a body that is not being adequately fed and not being adequately sheltered. And November is worse. And December is worse than that. The families that held out the longest were the ones that managed to find each other, to regroup in small clusters, to pool whatever resources they had salvaged and share body heat and the labor of keeping fires going through the night. But even those groups were operating at a fraction of the capacity they had possessed before Palo Duro, and every week that passed ground them down further. Hunting on foot for small game, rabbits, prairie chickens, the occasional deer, could keep a small group alive in a caloric sense, but it could not produce the volume of fat and protein that the buffalo-based diet had provided. Without that high-fat intake, the body's ability to generate sustained metabolic heat through the cold hours of the night was diminished. Without that internal furnace burning at full capacity, the external layers of the system, which no longer existed anyway, would have needed to work even harder to compensate. The cycle was vicious and self-reinforcing. Less food meant less internal heat production. Less internal heat production meant more energy spent shivering through the night. More energy spent shivering meant more calories burned. More calories burned meant more food needed. More food needed meant more hunting required. More hunting required meant more energy spent during the day. And the food available through on-foot hunting could not keep pace with the demand. The people were being consumed by the arithmetic of survival, an equation that the complete system had balanced perfectly for generations, but that now, with most of its terms removed, could not be solved. The U.S. Army did not need to pursue every family individually across the plains. The officers who planned the Red River War understood exactly what they had done at Palo Duro, and they understood that time and temperature would finish what the battle had started. Army patrols continued to sweep through the region, maintaining pressure, preventing the scattered bands from regrouping in sufficient numbers to rebuild, and making it clear that there was no safe place left on the open plains. But the patrols were secondary to the real weapon, which was the approaching winter itself. The same winter that the Comanche had managed, controlled, and slept through in comfort for as long as anyone could remember was now the instrument of their defeat, not because the winter had changed, but because the system that had tamed it had been destroyed. The reservation at Fort Sill, in what is now southwestern Oklahoma, became the destination that the fleeing bands were being driven toward, not always by direct military force, but by the simple, grinding reality that it was the only place left where food and shelter were available. The U.S. government had established the reservation system years earlier as the intended destination for all Plains tribes, and the agencies at Fort Sill and elsewhere distributed rations of beef, flour, sugar, and coffee to the indigenous people who came in and agreed to stay. The quality and quantity of those rations were often inadequate, the conditions on the reservations were frequently terrible, and the entire system was shot through with corruption, incompetence, and deliberate cruelty. But it was shelter and food, and for people who had been starving and freezing on the open plains for weeks, it was the only option that did not end in death. Through October and November of 1874, bands began arriving at Fort Sill. They came in small groups, families and fragments of families, exhausted, thin, many of them suffering from exposure and malnutrition. They surrendered their weapons. They surrendered whatever horses they had managed to retain. They were counted, cataloged, and assigned to locations on the reservation. The process was humiliating in ways that went beyond the simple fact of military defeat. These were people who had controlled a territory larger than most European nations, who had dictated the terms of engagement to every power that had entered their land, who had built a civilization adapted so precisely to its environment that the best-equipped military force on the continent had been unable to defeat it through direct combat. And now they were standing in line to receive government-issued flour from men who did not speak their language and did not care about their history. The Kiowa and Southern Cheyenne bands that had been in the canyon came in as well, many of them on similar timelines. Lone Wolf of the Kiowa, who had been one of the most determined advocates of continued resistance, surrendered in February of 1875. The Army, determined to prevent future resistance, selected 72 warriors and leaders from the surrendered bands and shipped them to Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, over 1,500 miles from their homeland, where they were imprisoned for 3 years. Among those imprisoned was Mamanti, the Kiowa spiritual leader who had promised the people that Palo Duro Canyon would be safe. Mamanti died at Fort Marion in 1875, within months of his arrival. The cause of death was officially listed as illness, though some accounts suggest he died of grief as much as any physical ailment, broken by the knowledge that his spiritual assurances had failed and that the people who had trusted those assurances had lost everything. The Quahati held out the longest. They were the band that had always been the furthest from white contact, the most independent, the most resistant to any accommodation with the Americans. They had lived on the most remote stretches of the Llano Estacado, in the deepest canyons, the farthest reaches of Comancheria, and they had maintained their independence longer than any other Comanche band. Their young leader, Quanah Parker, was in his mid-20s during the Red River War, a man of extraordinary intelligence, physical ability, and personal charisma who would go on to become one of the most significant figures in the post-reservation history of the Comanche Nation. But in the winter of 1874-75, Quanah Parker was a man watching his world collapse around him. The Quahati tried to maintain their freedom through the winter, moving in small groups across the increasingly inhospitable plains, hunting what they could, sheltering where the terrain allowed, and avoiding the army patrols that continued to sweep the region. But the math did not work. Without the horse herds, they could not hunt buffalo in the quantities needed to rebuild. Without the buffalo, they could not process new hides for tipis or robes. Without tipis and robes, they could not establish functioning winter camps. Without functioning winter camps, they could not rest, recover, and prepare for the spring. Every element of recovery depended on elements that had been destroyed, and each missing piece prevented the restoration of the others. The Quahati surrendered at Fort Sill in June of 1875, the last free Comanche band to come in. They arrived with about 400 people and roughly 1,500 horses, the remnants of herds that had once numbered far higher. They surrendered their weapons and their horses and walked onto the reservation. The Southern Plains Indian Wars were over. The campaign that ended them had not been won through superior tactics in open battle. It had not been won by outfighting the Comanche, because the U.S. Army had spent decades trying that and failing. It had been won by identifying the system that made Comanche resistance possible and destroying that system's physical components at the one moment in the calendar when they could not be replaced in time. The destruction of the winter camps at Palo Duro Canyon was not a military victory in any traditional sense. It was an act of strategic demolition, aimed not at the enemy's fighting strength, but at the infrastructure that allowed that fighting strength to regenerate year after year. Mackenzie understood that the Comanche warrior was dangerous, but the Comanche warrior could be replaced as long as the system that sustained the Comanche people continued to function. Destroy the system, and the warriors had nowhere to go, nothing to eat, no way to stay warm, and no choice but to surrender or die. The distinction matters enormously because it tells us something profound about the system that was destroyed. The United States of America in 1874 was the most industrially powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere. It had a standing army equipped with modern firearms, supplied by railroads, fed by an agricultural economy that spanned a continent, and backed by a population of roughly 40 million people. It had defeated the Confederacy less than a decade earlier in the largest and most destructive war in the nation's history. It had the resources to put thousands of soldiers in the field simultaneously across multiple theaters of operation. And that nation, with all of its industrial might and military power, looked at a survival system built from canyon walls and buffalo hides and animal fat and heated rocks and concluded that the only realistic strategy was destruction, not imitation, not adaptation, destruction. Because copying the system would have required the army to fundamentally change the way it operated, to abandon its forts and supply lines and industrial logistics, to learn the land the way the Comanche knew it, to develop the skills and knowledge that Comanche women carried in their hands and passed to their daughters. That was not something the army was willing or able to do. So it chose the other path. It burned the tipis, slaughtered the horses, destroyed the food stores, and let the winter do the rest. That choice was effective. It ended the military resistance of the Southern Plains tribes within months. But it was not a victory over the Comanche survival system in any intellectual or technological sense. It was an admission that the system worked, that it worked so well the army could not compete with it, and that the only option left was to ensure it could never be deployed again. The physical infrastructure was destroyed. The tipis were ashes. The robes were burned. The pemmican stores were gone. The horse herds were slaughtered. The canyons that had sheltered generations of winter camps were occupied by the army and eventually by ranchers and settlers who transformed the land into something entirely different. But the knowledge survived. This is perhaps the most important part of the entire story, and it is the part that is least often told. The Comanche Nation did not cease to exist after the Red River War. The people who surrendered at Fort Sill in 1874 and 1875 were not erased from the earth. They were diminished, confined, impoverished, subjected to decades of reservation policies designed to strip away their language, their customs, their spiritual practices, and their identity. But they endured. The Comanche Nation exists today, headquartered in Lawton, Oklahoma, with enrolled membership numbering over 17,000 people. They have a tribal government, economic enterprises, educational programs, and cultural preservation initiatives that work actively to maintain and transmit the knowledge and traditions of their ancestors. The understanding of how the winter survival system worked, the principles behind each layer, the ecological knowledge of the canyons and the plains, the technical skills of teepee construction and hide processing and pemmican preparation, that understanding did not die when the camps burned. It lived on in the memories of the people who had built and used those camps. It was carried in the minds of the women who had constructed the teepees and tanned the robes and prepared the food. It was carried in the memories of the men who had selected camp locations and managed horse herds and navigated the canyons in the dark. It was passed forward, sometimes in diminished form, sometimes in fragments, through the brutal decades of reservation life and forced assimilation, through the boarding school era when children were taken from their families and punished for speaking their own language, through all the systematic attempts to sever the connection between the Comanche people and the knowledge their ancestors had accumulated over centuries. Some of that knowledge was lost. That is an honest and painful truth. Generations of forced separation from the land, from the buffalo, from the materials and conditions that had given the knowledge its context and purpose, inevitably eroded parts of the tradition. Skills that require practice to maintain, that require the physical act of doing them in real conditions to stay sharp, suffered when the conditions no longer existed and the practice was forbidden. But the core understanding, the principles, the logic, the deep ecological awareness that had shaped the system, proved more durable than the physical infrastructure that expressed it. Knowledge, unlike tipis, cannot be burned. And the legacy of that knowledge extends far beyond the Comanche nation itself, into realms that most modern people encounter every day without ever knowing where the ideas originated. Modern survival science, the academic and practical field that studies how human beings can survive in extreme environments, has drawn heavily and repeatedly from indigenous cold weather techniques, including many of the specific principles that the Comanche and other Plains tribes employed in their winter survival systems. The principle of windbreak placement, selecting a campsite that uses natural terrain features to block prevailing winds before any shelter is constructed, is taught in virtually every wilderness survival course offered anywhere in the world today. It is the first thing you learn. Before you build a shelter, before you start a fire, before you do anything else, you choose a location that minimizes your exposure to wind, because wind is the single most aggressive driver of heat loss in cold conditions, and no amount of insulation can fully compensate for a poorly chosen site. The Comanche knew this. They expressed it not in a classroom lecture, but in the annual migration from the exposed high plains into the sheltered canyon systems of the Caprock Escarpment, a practice refined across generations of direct observation and experience. The principle of dead air insulation, creating a gap between an outer shell and an inner living space and filling that gap with still air or insulating material to reduce heat transfer, is the foundational concept behind modern insulated building construction, double-pane windows, insulated sleeping pads, layered winter clothing systems, and virtually every piece of cold weather gear manufactured today. The teepee's inner liner, hung several inches inside the outer cover to create exactly that kind of dead air gap, employed this principle centuries before it was described in any engineering textbook. When you zip yourself into a modern sleeping bag rated to 20 below zero and feel the warmth of your own body reflected back at you by the layers of synthetic insulation and trapped air surrounding you, you are benefiting from the same physical principle that a Comanche family used when they hung that inner liner and stuffed dried grass into the gap between it and the outer wall. The principle of radiant heat storage, using dense materials to absorb thermal energy from a fire and then slowly release that energy over an extended period after the fire itself has died down, is used today in masonry heaters, radiant floor heating systems, and portable heat packs designed for outdoor recreation and emergency survival. The heated stones that the Comanche pulled from their campfires, wrapped in leather, and tucked into their bedding were a direct, practical application of this principle, providing hours of sustained warmth from a single heating session. The principle of high-fat metabolic fueling, eating calorie-dense foods with high-fat content before prolonged cold exposure to sustain the body's internal heat production over many hours, is now standard practice in Arctic and Antarctic expedition planning. Modern cold weather ration packs are specifically formulated to include higher fat content than standard military or civilian rations, because research has confirmed exactly what the Comanche knew from experience. That fat provides the slow, sustained energy release that the body needs to maintain its core temperature through long periods of cold stress. Pemmican itself has experienced a revival in modern outdoor and survival communities. Companies now manufacture and sell commercially produced pemmican marketed specifically for backcountry travelers, ultralight hikers, and cold weather adventurers, touting its calorie density, its nutritional completeness, its long shelf life, and its effectiveness as a cold weather food. The recipes vary, some using beef instead of buffalo, some adding modern ingredients. But the core concept is unchanged from what the Cree and the Comanche and dozens of other indigenous peoples developed centuries ago. a concentrated mixture of dried meat and rendered fat, designed to keep a human body fueled and warm in conditions where conventional food fails. The principle of banked coals, covering dying embers with ash to insulate them and keep them alive through the night for rapid-fire restarting in the morning, is taught in Boy Scout handbooks, military survival manuals, and bushcraft courses around the world. It is considered such basic knowledge that most people who learn it never stop to wonder where it came from or who first figured it out. Even the conical geometry of the teepee, its ability to shed wind load, handle snow accumulation, and maintain structural integrity in conditions that destroy flat-walled or dome-shaped shelters, has influenced modern tent design. High-end expedition tents designed for use in extreme wind conditions, the kind used by mountaineering teams on Everest and in Antarctic research stations, incorporate design principles that echo the teepee's solutions to the same physical problems. All of these principles, every single one of them, are now taught in courses and written about in manuals and built into products without any acknowledgement of where they came from. The indigenous peoples who developed them, who tested them against real conditions over real generations with real consequences for failure, are almost never credited in the textbooks and product descriptions and training curricula that benefit from their innovations. The knowledge is used. The source is forgotten. Or worse, the source is remembered only in the simplified, distorted form of the noble savage, the romanticized primitive who lived in harmony with nature through some kind of mystical instinct rather than through the systematic application of accumulated empirical knowledge. The Comanche did not survive the Southern Plains winter through instinct. They survived it through engineering, through ecology, through material science that was expressed in the selection and processing of hides rather than in laboratory reports, through thermodynamics that was understood in practical terms, which stones hold heat, which furs trap air, which foods burn slow, rather than in mathematical equations, through architectural design that was tested not in wind tunnels, but in actual winds, on actual nights, with actual families sleeping inside the structures. The knowledge was rigorous. The testing was brutal. The iteration was continuous. And the results were so effective that the most powerful military force on the continent concluded that destruction was easier than competition. When you stand in a modern outdoor gear store and look at a sleeping bag filled with synthetic insulation designed to trap air in tiny pockets between hollow fibers, you are looking at an industrial imitation of buffalo fur. When you see a tent designed with a rainfly separated from the inner canopy by a gap of dead air, you are looking at a manufactured version of the teepee's inner liner. When you pick up a packet of freeze-dried, high-calorie trail food designed for cold-weather backcountry travel, you are holding a processed descendant of pemmican. When you read a survival manual that tells you to choose a campsite in the lee of a ridge or a canyon wall before you do anything else, you are reading advice that Comanche grandmothers gave to their granddaughters 300 years ago. The connections are direct and the debt is real. But the story of the Comanche winter survival system is not ultimately a story about technology, although the technology was extraordinary. It is not ultimately a story about military conflict, although the conflict was devastating. It is not ultimately a story about destruction, although the destruction was nearly total. It is a story about knowledge. About how knowledge is built, how it is held, how it is transmitted, and how it endures even when the physical world it was built to navigate has been transformed beyond recognition. The Comanche built their survival system through centuries of observation. They watched the land. They watched the weather. They watched the animals. They watched the way heat moved through different materials, the way wind behaved in different terrain, the way the body responded to different foods in different conditions. They observed, and they remembered. They tried things, and when those things worked, they kept doing them. And when those things failed, they stopped doing them and tried something else. The successes were passed to the next generation. The failures were remembered as warnings. Over time, across many generations, the accumulated weight of all that observation and experimentation and memory produced a system of extraordinary sophistication, a system that addressed every major vector of heat loss that the human body faces in cold conditions: wind, conduction, radiation, evaporation, and metabolic insufficiency, with a specific, targeted solution for each one. That system was not written down. It was not stored in a library or a database. It was carried in the minds and hands of living people, in the skills of the women who built the tipis and tanned the robes and prepared the pemmican, in the knowledge of the men who selected the camp locations and managed the horse herds and navigated the canyons, in the shared understanding of the entire community about how each piece of the system connected to every other piece. That form of knowledge storage, human memory, and practice skill is more fragile than a book or a hard drive. It can be disrupted by the forced removal of a people from their land. It can be degraded by the separation of children from their parents. It can be damaged by the destruction of the materials and conditions that give it meaning. But it is also more resilient than it appears because it lives in people, and people are remarkably persistent. The Comanche who walked onto the Fort Sill Reservation in 1874 and 1875 carried that knowledge with them. They carried it through decades of poverty and imposed dependence. They carried it through the boarding school era, when their children were taken away and forbidden to speak Comanche and punished for practicing Comanche traditions. They carried it through the allotment era, when reservation lands were broken up and distributed to individual families in a deliberate attempt to destroy communal land ownership and the social structures that depended on it. They carried it through the 20th century, through world wars in which Comanche men served with distinction, including the legendary Comanche code talkers of World War II who used their language, the language that the boarding schools had tried to eradicate, as an unbreakable military code in the European theater. They carried it into the 21st century, where the Comanche nation continues to exist, to govern itself, to educate its children, and to work actively to preserve and transmit the knowledge and traditions that their ancestors built on the canyon floors of the Texas Panhandle. The physical infrastructure can be burned. The horse herds can be slaughtered. The canyons can be fenced and turned into state parks. The buffalo can be hunted to near extinction and then slowly, painfully, brought back from the edge over the course of a century. But the knowledge, if even a thread of it survives, if even one grandmother remembers how the liner was hung, if even one elder can describe the way the stones were heated, if even one family keeps making pemmican from the old recipe, then the system is not truly dead. It is waiting. The Comanche survival system was never about being tougher than the cold. Every people who lived on the Great Plains were tough. The Kiowa were tough. The Cheyenne were tough. The Arapaho were tough. The settlers who came later were tough in their own way. The soldiers who froze in their summer uniforms on the Llano Estacado were tough enough to keep marching even when the cold was killing them. Toughness is a human universal. When conditions demand it, people endure. But endurance alone, raw physical resistance to suffering, is not a survival strategy. It is the absence of a strategy. It is what you fall back on when everything else has failed, and it has a limit, and the Plains winter will find that limit every single time. The Comanche did not fall back on endurance. They built a system that made endurance unnecessary. They engineered their environment so thoroughly, so comprehensively, so intelligently, that the winter night was not something to be endured, but something to be managed, controlled, and ultimately slept through in comfort. The canyon blocked the wind so that the teepee could hold the warmth. The teepee's double wall construction and adjustable ventilation created a controllable interior climate that could be heated with a small fire without suffocating the occupants. The buffalo robes, taken from winter bison and tanned with exacting skill, insulated the sleeper against the frozen ground below and the cold air above with hollow cord fibers that trapped warmth with an efficiency that modern synthetic materials still struggle to equal. The heated stones, dense and carefully selected, absorbed thermal energy from the fire and released it slowly through the night, providing hours of radiant warmth directly into the bedding long after the flames had died down. The high-fat diet of pemmican, marrow, and buffalo meat fueled the body's own internal heat production with slow-burning calories that sustained metabolic thermogenesis through the entire length of a 12-hour winter night. The horses, kept close and sometimes brought inside the teepee itself, added their substantial body heat to the shared space. The banked coals, covered with ash and kept alive through the night, ensured that the morning fire could be restored in minutes instead of the dangerous half-hour struggle of a cold start. And the dried buffalo chips, abundant everywhere the herds grazed, meant that fuel was never a limiting factor even in the most exposed and treeless stretches of the plains. Each layer addressed a specific physical problem. Each layer reinforced the others. Each layer compensated for the potential failures of the others. The result was not a single solution, but a system, resilient, redundant, and refined across centuries of real-world testing against conditions that killed the unprepared with mechanical efficiency. The next time you pull a sleeping bag rated to 20 below out of its stuffed sack and climb inside and feel the warmth close around you, think about what you are using. You are using trapped air. You are using dead space insulation. You are using the same principle that a hollow bison hair uses to hold warmth against a sleeping body. The next time you eat a high-calorie energy bar before heading out into cold weather, think about what you are eating. You are eating concentrated fuel for your body's own heat production. You are eating the same metabolic strategy that pemmican provided. The next time you choose a campsite in the shelter of a ridge or a tree line instead of on an exposed hilltop, think about what you are doing. You are selecting your terrain the way a Comanche grandmother selected hers, reading the land for the features that will protect you from the wind before you ever drive a stake or light a match. These are not coincidences. These are direct inheritances from people who figured out the answers to these problems long before anyone with a laboratory or a research grant ever asked the questions. The Comanche did not have thermometers. They did not have equations for thermal conductivity. They did not have wind chill charts or metabolic rate calculators or any of the instruments and frameworks that modern science uses to describe and quantify the interaction between the human body and cold environments. What they had was observation. What they had was memory. What they had was the willingness to pay attention to what the land and the weather and the animals and their own bodies were telling them, and to remember what worked and what did not, and to pass that memory forward with the seriousness and precision that the stakes demanded. Because the stakes were absolute. If your system failed on a January night on the Llano Estacado, you did not get to write a paper about what went wrong and try again next winter. You died. Your family died. And the knowledge you carried died with you. That pressure, that absolute, unforgiving accountability, produced a system of extraordinary quality. The Comanche survived the cold not because they were tougher than the weather. They survived it because they were smarter than it. And that intelligence, that accumulated, hard-won, generation-spanning understanding of how to live on a piece of land that most outsiders considered uninhabitable, is the real legacy of the Comanche winter survival system, a legacy that outlasted the burning of the tipis, the slaughter of the horses, the destruction of the food stores, and every attempt to erase it from the memory of the people who built it. The camps are gone. The canyons are quiet now. Palo Duro is a state park where tourists drive down paved roads to the canyon floor and take photographs of the same red walls that once sheltered families sleeping warm through freezing nights in buffalo robes beside low fires. The buffalo herds that once darkened the plains in numbers that European observers described as beyond counting are reduced to managed populations in parks and preserves, a fraction of what they once were, slowly rebuilding from the edge of extinction. The open grassland of the Llano Estacado is fenced and plowed and pumped dry by irrigation wells drawing from the Ogallala Aquifer, the same aquifer that fed the springs in the canyon floors where the Comanche made their winter camps. The world has changed. The land has changed. The people who built the system have changed, adapted, survived in new forms and under new conditions, as they always have. But the knowledge remains. Not in every detail, not in every technique, not with the completeness it once had when it was a living, practiced, daily reality for thousands of people across 240,000 square miles of the southern Great Plains. But in its principles, in its logic, in its deep understanding of the relationship between the human body and the cold world around it, the knowledge endures. It endures in the Comanche Nation itself, in the cultural memory and ongoing traditions of a people who refuse to disappear. It endures in the survival courses and outdoor schools that teach its principles to new generations of students who will never set foot on the Llano Estacado. It endures in the gear and the food and the shelter designs that modern industry produces by applying, often unknowingly, the same solutions that Comanche women and men worked out through centuries of patient, dangerous, life or death experimentation. It endures because knowledge, real knowledge, the kind that is built through observation and tested through experience and refined through generations of accumulated memory, is harder to destroy than any physical object. You can burn a teepee. You cannot burn the understanding of why it was shaped the way it was shaped, why the liner was hung the way it was hung, why the smoke flaps were adjusted the way they were adjusted. You can slaughter a horse herd. You cannot slaughter the understanding of what those horses meant and how they fit into a larger system of survival that made an entire civilization possible. You can destroy a winter's supply of pemmican. You cannot destroy the understanding that fat burns slow and keeps the body warm through the long hours of a freezing night. The smoke that rose from Palo Duro Canyon in September of 1874 marked the destruction of a physical infrastructure. It did not mark the destruction of the intelligence that created it. That intelligence belongs to the Comanche people, and it always will. And for anyone willing to listen, willing to look past the simplified stories and the romantic distortions, and the convenient forgetting that has characterized so much of the way this history has been told, the lessons are still there, still clear, still as practical and relevant as they were on any freezing night 300 years ago on the floor of a Texas canyon. Surviving the cold was never about being tougher than the weather. It was about being smarter than it. The Comanche were smarter than it. And the proof is not in any museum or any textbook. The proof is in the fact that you are hearing this story at all, because the people who lived it and the knowledge they carried survived everything that was done to destroy them.